Hello and welcome to today's webinar on autism and menopause. My name is Rebecca Sterry and I'm Director of External Affairs at Autistica, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. For those of you that are new to us, Autistica is the UK's leading autism research and campaigning charity. We exist to create breakthroughs that enable all autistic people to live happier, healthier, longer lives. We work with autistic people, we fund research and carry out research ourselves, and we shape policy to make sure that the evidence generated through research has real-world impact. And a big part of that is sharing the latest research and evidence-based practice with people like you. And that's what these webinars are all about. Today's webinar is in two sections, and there's going to be a short Q&A after each section with a larger Q&A towards the end. The speakers will be asking for your top tips and your research priorities. So I'll hand the session over to the team now. I'm joined by Rachel Moseley, Julie Gamble-Turner, Richard Visser, and Rebecca Charlton. So I'll hand over to you now.
Hello, so I'm going to start us off. So I will share my screen and hopefully you will be able to see it. So thank you for joining us today for this webinar. We're really excited to tell you about what people have been up to, but also to hear your thoughts on what we talk about today. So I'm going to start off. My name is Rebecca Charlton. I'm a professor of psychology at Goldsmiths University, and I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the menopause quite generally. Then I'm going to hand over to Julie Gamble-Turner and Rachel Moseley, who are going to talk to you about why autistic people might have a harder time during the menopause. I'm going to have a little break and ask you for some top tips. And then Richard Visser will give the last talk of the session, talking about menopause health and healthcare access. And again, we'll have some time for your preferences and ideas about where research should focus in the future. And we'll have some time for general questions. So after Julie and Rachel's talk, there'll be time for questions. After Richard's talk, there'll be time for questions. And we'll have some general questions at the very end. Okay, so the menopause. What is the menopause and what is happening in the body? What impact does this have on behavior? And how do people manage? So very simply, the menopause represents a change in ovarian function, which leads to variability in hormone levels, menstrual periods stop, and over time, hormone levels lower. So that all sounds very simple and straightforward, doesn't it? It's a little bit more complicated than that. So menopause usually happens between the ages of about 45 and 55. So quite a wide window for when this occurs for people. As we've said, as ovary function declines, the body produces less estrogen and progesterone and more follicle-stimulating hormones and luteinizing hormones. So you tend to see graphs like this with these very sort of smooth curves of a reduction in some hormones and an increase in others. But I think that this figure is actually probably a little bit more how most people feel about the menopause, where although there's a gradual trend of a change or a decline in some of these hormones, there's quite a lot of variability over quite short periods of time, with the hormone levels going up and down very, very quickly. When we think about menopause, we usually divide it into 4 stages. Pre-menopause, which is when people who are biologically female are fertile and they are having regular menstrual periods and have no symptoms. The perimenopause period is when people's menstrual periods begin to become quite variable and hormone levels begin to fluctuate. Menopause is when periods are stopping, and this is when most symptoms really occur during menopause. And then post-menopause period, usually these symptoms stabilize. And although we often talk about menopause and premenopause in these 4 stages, if we look at the criteria, the international criteria for the menopause, there are actually considered to be 10 stages, so a little bit more complex than that. So 6 of these stages are pre-menopausal, before the last menstrual period, and then 4 after. And I think the main thing I want you to notice from this figure is that where we see things like duration in that blue, the last of those blue rows, you can see that the timelines of this keep saying variable, or between 1 and 3 years, between 3 and 6 years. So I think the really important thing here is that everybody's experience is going to be different, both a different duration and overall a different length of time to go through this process. So why is menopause important? Well, approximately 13 million people in the UK are either peri or postmenopausal. And if you look at that pie chart on the right, the green section are people who are biologically born male. The two purple colors are people who are biologically born female. And that darker purple at 17% are the proportion of people going through menopause. So that's a pretty large proportion of the population, 17% of the population going through menopause at the moment. We know that menopause is associated with a range of different symptoms, which have a real variability in the length of time that they last, but it can be up to 8 years. And so that's quite a long time to experience symptoms, which can sometimes be quite distressing. So what is the experience of the menopause? Well, as I said, it's important to note that this is going to be different for every individual. No two people will have the same set of symptoms or experiences, but also within yourself, within each individual, symptoms can vary over time and in terms of severity. We usually think of menopause symptoms as being the ones that are on the screen now. So hot flushes and night sweats, mood changes, low energy and tiredness. People often talk about mood changes both in terms of low mood and depression, but also anger and becoming very irritable, but lots of physical changes too, and cognitive changes like brain fog or difficulty concentrating. Now, there are over 30 symptoms, and I've just listed the most common here. And if we think about symptoms and why this is important in menopause, it's because these symptoms are so variable and people's experiences are so different. So while we're beginning to understand more about what's happening in the body, what we still don't really understand is why there's a range of different experiences. So about 20% of people who go through menopause have very few symptoms at all. 80% of people experience things like hot flushes and night sweats, but that's for some people, that's all they experience. However, within that group, about 62% of people experience symptoms that are severe enough to affect their well-being, and a quarter of people experience symptoms which are described as debilitating. So across this range of people, we have about 20% with almost no symptoms, and about the same level, a little bit more, quarter, experiencing symptoms which are debilitating in their everyday lives. So we get this real different experiences for different individuals. So another aspect of importance is that every person who's female assigned at birth is going to go through the menopause at some point. And so for some people, this can be an incredibly negative experience. So as I said, although we're beginning to understand more about what's happening in the body, we still don't really understand why people's experiences can be so different. What we do know is that pre-existing mental and physical health conditions can lead to worsening of some of the symptoms or worsening of experiences. So what do people do to manage menopause? Well, often the suggestions are fairly general in terms of looking after yourself. So increasing, making sure you rest, eating healthy and exercising, really looking after yourself and doing things that support your own well-being. For lots of people, having lots of information and finding out more about the menopause is helpful. For other people, that can be a bit overwhelming, especially if some people don't experience these very negative symptoms, which are most debilitating for some people. Some people like to talk to others, especially their friends or healthcare professionals, and for other people, they don't want to discuss their symptoms. So again, real individual approaches to management. In terms of more medical type treatments, the most common are hormone related, so either hormone replacement therapy or testosterone and estrogen for different symptoms of menopause. And then other treatments may be related to symptoms or associated things that occur during menopause. So either taking medication for night sweats, taking medication for depression if that worsens during the menopausal period. And again, people are very variable in terms of whether or not they are happy to have talking therapies or whether they respond to them in response to some of the symptoms around mood. So what are the next steps and what is going to happen next in this webinar? Well, as I've said, we're only just beginning to explore why different people have different experiences. There's very little about the experience of autistic or neurodiverse people through menopause, although Rachel, Julie, and Richard are some of the people who have done some of this groundbreaking work in this area, and they're going to talk to you about what they've been up to. And we're very aware that autistic experiences throughout the lifespan may interact or intersect with menopausal symptoms to make menopause a real challenging time for autistic people. So there's definitely a lot more work to be done. So I'm going to say thank you for your attention, and I'm going to pass you over, stop sharing my screen, and then I'm going to pass you over to Rachel and Julie, who will take over and talk to you a little bit more about autistic experiences of the menopause.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. So hopefully people can see my slides now, but hopefully you can't see my notes.
Yes, we can see your slides, Rachel.
Fantastic. Hello, everyone. It's so lovely to be here with you all today. Just to introduce myself very quickly, I'm Rachel, and I'm a research psychologist at Bournemouth University. And over the past few years, myself and my colleague Julie, who will introduce herself in a minute, have been doing research on autistic experiences of menopause. So we're going to share with you some of these findings today. And I want to just explain, in this talk, we'll focus just on the papers really that we've published so far. So hopefully there'll be more findings that we can share with you in future years, because we've done various different things with different collaborators. And I'll also just note that there are links to the research that we've published so far that will come up later in this talk. So I'll hand over to Julie to get us started on this topic.
Okay. Thank you, Rachel. So I'm Julie Gamble-Turner. I'm a health psychologist and a professor of psychology at Bournemouth University. So as Rachel says, when we started looking at menopause back in 2018, and we were looking at menopause and autism, we expected that researchers would have already considered how autistic people might cope with it. And we expected that we'd probably find a whole wealth of research papers to look through. And we were really surprised to find that there was not a single paper out there. So when we approached this topic, we did so through the lens of our backgrounds in psychology, in particular neuropsychology and health psychology, because we know that menopause is really important in relation to health. And menopause plays a huge role in health and well-being, not just during the menopause, but also throughout the rest of the lifespan. So your experience during menopause is important for the rest of the lifespan, beyond that menopausal transition. Just wanted to give you some context as to why we were looking at this intersection between menopause and autism. And we know that across the lifespan, there are a number of critical periods of development in relation to health, particularly 3 critical reproductive transition points, namely puberty, pregnancy, and menopause, or perimenopause, if you want to use the 3 Ps. Now, a person's experience of these previous reproductive transition points, puberty or pregnancy, and postnatal period, they're very important so that in times when hormonal change, they are times when hormonal changes are really dramatic and it affects an individual's experience of menopause. So we felt it was reasonable to assume or to believe that autistic people might particularly struggle with menopause because studies have shown that they have a greater or more difficult time with these reproductive transition points. So we know that autistic people really struggle at puberty and menarche when periods are starting. And periods continue to be difficult for many neurodivergent people after menarche. A number of studies suggest that neurodivergent people are particularly sensitive to hormone fluctuations. So autistic people have told us that they feel much more emotionally reactive and they're more sensitive to stress. And they find everyday life more challenging to deal with during their period. And some people report that autism-related challenges like sensory sensitivities are heightened and their self-care and daily living skills are affected. Now, there's very little research following up on hormonal transitions as autistic people age, but we do know that during pregnancy and childbirth, this other stage, life transition, during pregnancy and childbirth, autistic people can experience a flare-up in their sensory sensitivities. Some people report more extreme and frequent meltdowns during pregnancy, for example. So these are points of immense hormone change, and they can continue into the postnatal period, where autistic people are more likely to experience postnatal depression and anxiety. And some autistic people report painful and distressing hypersensitivity to touch during breastfeeding, for example. So when it comes to the hormonal transition of menopause, we ask the question of whether autistic people might experience it as more challenging for many of the same reasons as they do in these other transitions in life.
So menopause is challenging for many of the same reasons, as Julie said, as these other transition points, essentially because it's a process of change. We don't have a lot of control over it, and it's quite unpredictable. And these changes affect your body, your emotions, your mental states and thought processes. And it's hard to know whether menopause is actually happening. What's tricky is that doctors can't even give you much of a roadmap, even if you're experiencing a non-autistic average menopause. And so this is obviously going to be quite difficult for autistic people because we can really struggle with change at the best of times. It also affects things that are already difficult for us, like regulating your emotions, executive functions, sensory sensitivities, all already difficult. And it involves changes in the body, which can be likewise hard to tolerate, especially if people suffer from conditions like eating disorders, which are more common in autistic people. And menopause can just generally affect your mental health, which again is problematic if you already struggle with your mental health. Autistic people often tend to have poorer healthcare education around sex and reproduction. So they might well go into menopause with less idea about what to expect. They tend to have smaller social circles and sometimes to miss out on intimate friendships. So with menopause, this is especially important because it's quite a taboo area. People often don't like to talk about it. So if you consider the ways that people typically learn about menopause, it's often through close relationship with friends and family. As such, it's possible that autistic people will miss out on some of the critical ways that information about menopause is conveyed. And they might also lack social support to help cope with menopause. Autistic people very often have poorer access to healthcare, including preventative healthcare. So, for instance, smear tests and so forth. So they might have reduced likelihood of discussing menopause before it happens. And because of these difficulties accessing healthcare and communicating with healthcare professionals, it might be harder for autistic people to have the conversations they need to when a menopause does happen. It might be harder for them to get support from healthcare practitioners, the loved ones, and this might be to the greatest extreme if they also have an intellectual disability. If they struggle with spoken language, they might really struggle to express their distress. And as Celia said, we know that the way you've experienced your life previously to menopause affects the way you experience menopause. Previous life adversity or trauma actually affects the way you experience menopause. So stress changes the nervous system and it makes us experience future life events as more stressful. This is potentially really significant for autistic people because they're much more likely to experience adverse life events and trauma. We also know that autistic people are more likely to have intersectional identities which can make menopause more difficult, such as being trans or non-binary. And finally, it's important to mention that menopause happens at a time of life where people have to contend with a lot of things going on. Physical health issues, both in themselves and their loved ones, and changes in their support networks. So as autistic people grow older, their support networks very often change and for some decline. People are very often dependent on their parents and close family for social connection, support, emotion regulation. And at midlife, when menopause occurs, these support networks change. Autistic people might have to cope with illness or the loss of close loved ones, and this can lead to them being more lonely. We know that people tend to get more isolated as they age, meaning they might struggle more with loneliness. And sadly, support often declines too. We know that autistic people become more invisible as they age, so far as support services are concerned. We also need to recognise that because recognition of autism has always been poor in girls, women, and people with ovaries, there are whole generations of autistic people who grew up in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, even the 2000s, who were never diagnosed. So these individuals aren't labelled autistic, but they're very often very well known in healthcare settings. They are those with chronic mental illness or physical illness, who struggle to hold down a job or a relationship, who very sadly have often labelled themselves or been labelled by others as just a bit of a mess, a failure, broken, bad at life, without knowing that there was a word to describe and explain why they've struggled. So a lot of these people will be going into menopause with a lot of trauma and without the benefit of knowing they are autistic. So what happens then?
So we've conducted a handful of studies, Rachel and I have, interviewing autistic people about their experiences of menopause. Only 2 of those are published at present, but I'm going to present some of the findings from those. So in terms of what we've found so far, the first point is that people often go into menopause unprepared. So we found that autistic people often entered menopause with very little knowledge about what to expect. They expected certain symptoms, particularly, for example, hot flushes, but they didn't anticipate how those might feel or what wider repercussions they'd experience, what wider symptoms. Some people were extremely frightened and confused about what was happening to them because it didn't resemble sorts of stories about menopause that they'd heard. And what they were experiencing just didn't really resemble a normal neurotypical menopause. So that meant it was much more difficult to read or hear a description of menopause and to identify with it. Secondly, we found that menopause amplifies neurodivergence, and neurodivergence amplifies menopause. So menopause is really emerging as a time where pre-existing autistic features can be amplified. Being autistic also seems to affect how menopausal symptoms are experienced. So autism affects how a person experiences menopause, and menopause affects how they experience their autism. And some autistic people said that the experience of menopause absolutely floored them, and that in some cases they just couldn't function. They couldn't leave the house, or the combination of being autistic while experiencing menopause makes both intolerable. And some described it as life-threatening in terms of its impact on their quality of life and on their mental health. For some, menopause derailed their health and their lives to such an extent that they were diagnosed as autistic during the time that they started having menopausal symptoms. If we remember that because recognition of female-presenting autistic people has traditionally been so problematic, many had grown up undiagnosed. Perhaps they fitted into the world as people who struggle with their occupational, social, and romantic lives. They may have been chronically unemployed, chronically unwell, physically and mentally. They may have been people who saw themselves as broken or weird. And so with the turbulence and the amplification of autistic features during menopause, some of those individuals realized that there is a word to describe their experience or their experiences, and that was autism. So since we published this work, there have been a few additional qualitative studies, one which was done by Richard and colleague, and there's further work that we've conducted. And what is really striking is that you find similar experiences that are reported by independent groups of autistic people. So the findings appear to be consistent. And across these studies, participants suggest that menopause was made more difficult by being undiagnosed, and people just didn't understand why they were struggling so badly, why they weren't coping, and what was wrong with them. Some people felt like the knowledge of being autistic would have helped them, but put coping strategies and support in place, and to be able to be more self-compassionate when things got more difficult.
So autistic people seem to have a lot of the same physical experiences as non-autistic people, but they might experience them more intensely. So night sweats, hot flushes, irregular periods, insomnia, fatigue. But we also found that people might have less common symptoms like flare-ups of chronic illness. But menopause seems to create broader challenges that we categorize as cognitive, emotional, social, and sensory. So cognitive changes, executive function. So people often described differences and deterioration in their ability to manage multiple tasks, meet deadlines, plan, pay attention. One person described it as walking through life with a head full of cotton wool and a body that refuses to behave. People found it much harder to look after themselves, to be independent, to manage daily life. Some people lost jobs, some people fell into financial arrears, some became highly dependent on partners or elderly parents for self-care. And this was also really damaging for their self-worth and mental health. People who had co-occurring ADHD also found themselves much less able to control their attention and manage their daily lives. And some people reported being utterly exhausted, just having extreme fatigue and burnout. People reported that their coping strategies failed during menopause, and they were much more reactive to environmental stress. So some people reported extreme meltdowns, severe depression, greater self-injury, and more feelings of suicidality and suicide attempts. And some people reported being much less capable of social interaction, feeling far more overwhelmed by having to socialize. People found that it was much more exhausting and in some cases just impossible to maintain the mask. So existing difficulties with verbal communication, eye contact, understanding non-literal language these things became that much more severe and difficult. And people reflected that many things in their lives were changing around the time of menopause. People were retiring, they were leaving the workforce, or they were actually withdrawing from work, which affects their sense of identity and self-worth. They were experiencing changes in their support network, with parents aging, being ill or dying, marital relationships changing, breaking down, partners and families having their own health challenges, children who are often neurodivergent, requiring support or leaving home. People talked about their own health conditions that were worsening, and a participant in an unpublished study so far called this time a Venn diagram of chaos, with menopause hitting at just the same time as all these other life changes. However, there was a lot of variation, and some people did see the silver linings of menopause, such as no more periods. Other people felt that there was less pressure to perform in the ways associated with femininity, either to be sexy or beautiful. Some people found that getting through menopause had taught them important life lessons, new ways of coping and resilience, especially if they came to their their autism diagnosis through the turmoil of these years. And people talking to us from the other side of menopause reported that their symptoms had abated. They didn't feel exactly the same as they did before menopause, as their bodies had gone through the transition, but it wasn't entirely bad on the other side. But you can see that there's a lot of variation between people. In drawing to a close, there's a few take-home messages we want to just put out there. First off, many people go into menopause with very little knowledge about what it entails. In part, this is because neurotypical descriptions of menopause don't resonate with many autistic people. And people in our research often speak about the distinction between menopause and autistic menopause. One participant put it as follows: it's not just that you're autistic and that you're menopausal, but you're going through autistic menopause. It's quite likely that there are qualitative and quantitative differences in the menopausal experiences of autistic and non-autistic people, but we don't know enough about how they differ, and we really need to know so we can help people be prepared. We often hear that people struggle to access support, particularly healthcare. Just as we know very little about autistic menopause, likewise, doctors are not very aware of autistic menopause and how it might differ. So professionals working with autistic people, while they might have that understanding of autism, they don't necessarily understand the biological changes that will happen throughout the lifespan. So we really need professionals to understand both autism and these biological transition points. And we also need to emphasize that menopause can be a time of crisis for people, a time of heightened suicidality and mental illness. Experiences were so variable, and some people had very little difficulty. So we need to be able to identify who might struggle and know how to help them when we can identify them. We'd just like to finish by thanking the participants who've taken part in our research so far, and thanking you all so much for listening. We're going to take some questions in a minute, but we're going to have a short break first. Before we do, there's going to be a time for you to share your thoughts with us. So we would love you to engage with us on our Padlets, where you can see the link there. And we'd love to hear your tips and advice for coping with menopause. So things that have helped for you, things that you might have heard about that have helped other people. This Padlet will stay open after the talk, so we're hoping that we can all pool our ideas here and it might be useful for people. So in the next few minutes, we're going to have a short break. Please feel free to engage with our Padlet, put your questions in the Q&A function. And you can also see just there that you can email us, but you can also access these studies, the ones that are published so far. There's accessible versions on the link that you can see there. And you can also download some of our favourite resources there.
Right there. So we're now going to have the Q&A for the session we've just had. As I say, there will be another Q&A session at the end as well. So I've got a couple of questions here. So the first one is, I know that it's been answered in the chat, but I'm going to ask it anyway. When are we said to be post-menopausal?
Do you want to take that one, Julie?
Yes, yeah, I can think that one. Yes, postmenopausal is after your periods have stopped for 12 months, then you're considered to be postmenopausal. However, symptoms don't stop at that point. Symptoms can carry on for a number of years after that. So it's a bit misleading thinking postmenopausal that everything is over and now you're postmenopausal. On the other side, the symptoms do continue. There are different phases of postmenopause, early, mid, and later postmenopause as you age.
And do you have any advice for autistic or ADHD women seeing their GPs for HRT?
Want me to start this one?
Rachel, you can take that one.
Well, I think we might both have something to say. It's really tricky. It's we know sadly that your healthcare and your access to HRT is a little bit of a postcode lottery, depending on your healthcare provider. It's very hard to know at present how many autistic or neurodivergent people do take HRT and how they experience it. One thing we were very interested to find out in our studies was to understand how people experienced HRT, whether it was helpful for them. And I think that was quite varied. Some people found it helpful, some people didn't. But in terms of advice for accessing it, I think this is really difficult. By all means, please feel free to direct your healthcare provider towards the resources that we've put together there. And I guess I would say hopefully you can make a really strong case if this is something you'd like to try. It might not be something that works for you, HRT, but you should have the right to try it and see if it does work for you. Would you add anything, Julie?
Just to say, really try and find a healthcare provider who is sympathetic, knowledgeable about HRT in the menopause and sympathetic. There's great variability out there, but there are an increasing number of healthcare providers who are especially trained in menopause. So don't give up if you haven't found the right person. Do keep trying to find a suitable person to help.
Yeah, I would agree that I think people's experiences is very variable. So some people have almost no problem getting on HRT and other people battle for years to get it. And likewise, I think some people do really well on HRT and don't want to come off it, and other people it doesn't work, or they just have horrible experiences. So it really is a very individual thing in terms of effectiveness. So I think give it a try, and if it works for you, then great. But don't feel that you need to keep battling for it if it doesn't work for you either. That there are maybe other things that might have a better approach for you as an individual.
Just as a small comment to add on in the end, of what both people have said. Just to say, I've seen several people talk about books, or if people are aware of particular healthcare providers that they've found brilliant, do put those things on our Padlet: books, websites, anything that will be useful for others to see.
Well, thank you for that. I've got another question here around executive functions. How does menopause affect executive functioning activities, daily living in autistic people?
Me? Oh, sure.
Who wants to have a go?
I'll start.
Raising our hands.
So some of the people we spoke to were working at the time when they went into menopause, or they had been working. some people found that they were no longer able to keep working because they might have been doing, I remember we had someone who was a receptionist, we had someone who was I think she was an academic, we had people in various lines of work, and they just found that they weren't able to keep up with the volume of work that they'd previously been able to. They weren't able to manage their time. We found that some people really could not manage competing demands at menopause, and they found it extremely distressing to have any a number of competing demands. They also would find brain fog, so they'd be standing in front of people and they wouldn't be able to talk to them. We found people would struggle with executive function around managing their families' lives, so managing food, childcare, and we also found people would struggle with it on a personal level, managing my basic self-care, so the washing, feeding myself, keeping my house tidy, all things that really rely on executive function. And so that's where a lot of people really had very bad outcomes in terms of losing jobs, falling into arrears, being dependent on others, and that had a really negative impact on their self-esteem as well. Do you want to add anything, Julie?
Yeah, I think that's great, Rachel.
I think that in terms of, people often describe the brain fog and the symptoms that Rachel's talking about, but actually if you look at sort of menopause literature more generally, the thing that people often focus on is memory, not executive function at all. So if you think about the cognitive changes that occur during menopause, often people's memories seems to get worse. So I think we have these sort of two things about what's happening over time, as in a memory might be getting a little bit worse, but in the moment, those real brain fog, difficulty managing sort of cognitive demands. So a bit of a mixed pattern, really. And I think still very little in terms of autism specific changes has been explored.
Well, thank you, everyone. I think it's probably time to move on to the second section of the webinar. Any questions we didn't get to, we'll sort of hopefully get to at the end when we've got a larger Q&A. And if we don't get to them then, we will get them answered by the speakers after the webinar. So I'll move on to our next session.
So I'll get myself started. So I'm Richard de Visser, as I was mentioning in introductions before, and I'm based at Brighton and Sussex Medical School. I'll try to talk at the same time as getting my slides up, because can I do two things at once? I hope so. And I will go, there we are. Hopefully you can see my title slide here, which I'm going to be talking about autism and sexual and reproductive well-being. And I'm going to give a bit of an overview of recent research we've done, which Rachel and Julie referred to earlier on, some current research we're doing, and also some planned studies. And actually, it kind of picks up a little bit on some of the comments that have already been made in the comments in the Q&A about what kind of things are we focusing on. So a lot of the research, the small amount of research that's been done so far has started to look at women's experiences, and where it's important to do more of that, because there's we're only starting out in this area, and we recognize that there's quite a range of people with different experiences. So it's important to cover all of those, but also we need to think about who is, what are health professionals doing? What do they know? What do they not know? What do they misunderstand? So that we can actually provide more appropriate, better care for women at various stages of that menopausal transition. And my email address is here. It's also going to be on my final slide. And if anyone has any questions or comments that you think of later on, then feel free to get in touch. So first thing I'm just going to say is that we're looking at the subjective experiences that people have. That's our main focus, is what is actually happening for people. How do they make sense of it? What's it actually like? And that's kind of going to be a mixture of the social kind of factors. So the social context, how we talk about menopause, what do we understand? It's going to be what we might call material factors. So it's actually the body, we're actually dealing with physical bodies as well. And all of this the social context, and the real, material bodies that we have combine to produce these intrapsychic or psychological experiences. So we're not talking about these things that are, yes, they're unique in terms of the way they're experienced by each individual, but they're influenced by what's happening in the body, but also socially what's going on. How do we understand and talk about these things? How do we misunderstand these things as well? What do people anticipate? What do they expect? As noted in the previous presentation, reproductive cycles and reproductive transmissions may be especially tumultuous for autistic people because of the heightened sensory sensitivity. It's been noted in some research that premenstrual syndrome may be more common or more difficult in autistic women, and the different communication capacities and different communication needs and different social support networks mean that the experience of menopause and menstruation can be quite different for autistic women. And they often find healthcare interactions to be unsatisfactory because they may be apprehensive about discussions with health professionals, not knowing what to talk about, what they can talk about, or how to talk about them. And this may also occur in the context where they may have smaller or different social networks of support. So it's not the case necessarily that they have the same support that other women may have talking about these particular issues, or that other women may have talking about other issues in general. So what we have is a kind of a concentration of difficulty in some cases that makes this a much more difficult experience physically. It makes it a much more different, therefore it's a much more difficult experience psychologically, and also that's happening in a different kind of social context. So going back up to the top of my slide, you can see how these things are always interacting at all those different levels as we go along. So I'll talk a little bit about first of all, about the past research. And this is one thing that Rachel and Julie did mention. So the research that we've completed that carried out with Mariana Caravidis, and this is a paper that's, you can get free copies of it either by following the link that's there, or I can send you a copy if you send me an email. But we did a relatively small scale, and that's the thing about a lot of this research is because we're relying on, samples of people that we can get in touch with who feel comfortable engaging in this research. Often there are small scale exploratory studies where we focus in depth on people's experiences as a way of getting a sense of what the issues are. So in this study, we did interviews with 7 autistic women about their experiences of menopause. And we identified 3 themes. And I'm not going to read out all the quotes, and you're probably reading through some of these things as I'm talking. But one of the main things that came up when we asked people about their experiences of menopause was the uncertainty about changes. And this is something that's not unique to autistic women. So a lot of women will have this because there isn't a lot of discussion about this. Some women have good information, but a lot of women feel quite unaware or unprepared for those changes. But this is often particularly emphasized in a negative way or a more difficult way for autistic women. So if you've got the first quote from Olivia, and Olivia is not the person's real name. These are being obscured for reasons of protecting identities. But Olivia said, "My body has all kinds of sensory reactions, and I don't read it particularly well at the best of times. And it was just another thing that annoyed me about my body." So here was this idea about saying, well, already the relationship with my body and some of my sensory experiences is difficult. And then along comes menopause, and that's kind of, there's more disruption, and it may be unpredictable. As we go right back to the start, the idea that it's not just this steady kind of change, but it might be a very variable kind of pattern, means that it's hard to predict. And for anyone, that unpredictability is difficult. But if you're already finding some of those experiences difficult to begin with, that can only make it worse. And one of the things, just looking at the second quote here, where Ash said, "Nobody tells you about this as a woman." So just saying there's that lack of information generally, where a lot of women feel that they're not informed about these changes that might be happening. And you can see the quote from Dora as well. The second part of that says, well, we need to plan for these things. We need to plan to help girls before puberty happens so that they know what the changes might be. And they say it's the same with aging and menopause. We need to be preparing people better for those changes when they do occur, so that they're not dealing with it at this individual level. There needs to be much more discussion at that kind of social level. The second thing that we identified was around growing self-awareness. And there were 2 components to this. One was about the fact that for a lot of the women we're interviewing, they've been diagnosed with or identified as autistic later in life. So they're often dealing with these 2 transitions to bodily experiences, but also these changes to their sense of identity. And often they said that it was kind of, for some it made it quite difficult, but for some they said that because they've been dealing with similar difficulties before and trying to work out who they were and knowing that they had different experiences and had to function differently in society, that in some ways made it, they were able to adapt to some of these changes as well. But there were varied experiences in this context. So the first quote from Olivia said that, well, I'm very good at problem solving, but I was always using that skill to help other people. I was not able to do that for myself because I wasn't self-aware. And Olivia mentioned later in the interview that growing self-awareness meant she was able to say, actually, I know now that I need to look after myself a bit more. And this particular physiological change has heightened that sense of needing to look after myself. And others said, if you look at the quote from Grace as well, she said, well, I'm brilliant at masking. And actually, some of the time I really rather enjoy it. The question is whether I choose to anymore. So there was this growing realization that as someone got older and more experienced socially as well, about saying, do I need to do this anymore? Do I need to put on this performance? Can't I just actually be myself and let people know what's going on? That, of course, relies on people feeling informed and confident enough to do that. And that's not something we should just rely on individuals to do, but it's something we should be working out how we can help people to get to that kind of stage. And the quote from Ash at the bottom says, well, figuring out the autism stuff and the menopause, well, it wasn't really a midlife crisis. It was more of a new wave. So Ash reconceptualized this as a chance to rethink who they were and how they fit into society more generally, and decided not to necessarily fit into those stereotypical expectations of that people might have about saying, hey, this is a new phase of my life where I'm going to be a different kind of person. I'm going to focus on myself and what my needs might be. And the third theme that came up, which ties into the future research we're planning, is about navigating support options. So Olivia, one of the quotes here, she said, well, when it comes to medical research, women are so often ignored. Autism research is directed towards children. And we know already that autism research tends to be directed towards male children as well. So what you have is this double kind of exclusion, and it tends to focus on children, it tends to focus on boys, and therefore older women's experiences, or I don't mean older necessarily in old, but adult women's experiences tend to be overlooked. But then they also talked about where they could find information, and they found that not only were they unaware, but they also, as was noted in the earlier presentations and also was coming up in the Q&A and the comments in the chat, is that women also often found that the health professionals they were interacting with didn't know about, didn't understand, or didn't put into practice the knowledge that they had, which was about how autism might mean that menopause is a particularly difficult or different experience. So they said that they relied not on health professionals, but on other sources of information. So the quote from Isla, second to the bottom, says, well, my first point of call for information would be the internet, and then my husband, and then the doctor. So you can see there's this idea about, well, if they want information, they're not going straight to the doctor. There's some other sources of information, which might be online, or it might be someone that they knows them and their experiences, like their husband, and only then would it be going to the doctor if they needed more information. And Nina, the final quote here, said that sometimes there was experience that she referred to, that others referred to in our research, and I could see some of the comments earlier that people were saying they were just being fobbed off by health professionals by just saying, no, this is just something, it's all just, in your head, it's something that you've got to kind of deal with. And Nina said, well, it's not just in my head, and it's not just irrelevant. Sometimes I think I'm just making a fuss, or I'm made to feel like I'm making a fuss. But then when I talk to someone else, they're like, I have the same thing. So it was when these individual women spoke to other women having similar experiences, they realized that it wasn't just down to them. It wasn't just their doctor talking to them in this way. It wasn't just their experience. This was a shared experience that was being more broadly overlooked, and that there was a need for more attention to this and better awareness and understanding among health professionals. So that was the first study we did, which I said was exploratory, was laying trying to open up this field of study, and Rachel and Julie have done a lot more work in that area, and have made some really helpful contributions as well. But this is part of this growing body of evidence that shows that there really is a need to understand more about autistic women's experience of menopause, and to improve the kind of healthcare experiences that they have. So we decided, we're currently doing a study. We're in the middle of analyzing this. We've finished our data collection. We're doing some analysis. So what I'm presenting of this is partial analysis that's ongoing, and we're carrying out this research with Rachel and Julie, but also you can see other collaborators who are listed on the slide as well. And it's been done it's really relied on the help and support of Autistica as well, in terms of distributing the questionnaire and promoting the study. So what we did was an online survey of autistic women. We had around about 170 responses, but as usual, as always happens with this kind of thing, sometimes people, not all of those responses are complete. So we had 136 responses that were complete enough that we could use. And we wanted to look at the experience of menopause. We also wanted to broaden that out a little bit, to look at sexual health more broadly, to look at menstrual well-being, and to look at menopause, but to also look at that alongside physical and psychological well-being. Because if we only focused on menopause, we could say something about, yes, these experiences are bad, but we couldn't say how do they compare to experiences of healthcare in general. Are women's experiences of menopause-related healthcare consultations bad just because every consultation around health is bad for them and for other autistic women? So as I mentioned, the analysis is ongoing, but some of the things we're finding so far are really disappointing. It's good to have the information because it lets us say something maybe with some statistical numbers that are based on larger samples than were previously done. So it's good to have that information, but it's actually disappointing what we're finding, and not surprising. So prepare to be disappointed, but also maybe empowered in some way that now we have these stats to carry on with this. So the first thing we asked was, one of the questions we asked was how comfortable women felt discussing various health concerns with doctors or nurses in the GP context. So we wanted to narrow this down and make it a bit simpler. We only looked in the GP context, and we asked them to rate from 0 to 10, 10 being completely comfortable and 0 not at all. And not surprising, they found talking about physical health the thing that they were most comfortable discussing. It did vary depending on how they were doing that, but what women felt most comfortable was talking about physical health in person. They didn't feel as confident if it was a video consultation or phone consultation. It was important to ask those questions because increasingly the NHS is going to that digital first approach to healthcare. So more and more of those consultations these initial consultations at least, will be happening that way. And what you can see is they're not necessarily the ones that autistic women favor. People felt less confident, and clearly less confident, talking about sexual health, about menstrual-related health, and psychological well-being in general. And we asked for interest as well, how comfortable they felt talking about their autism in the general practice context. And again, the ratings weren't particularly high. So physical health, yes, these were the things that they felt most comfortable talking about. When it came to autism in particular, or how autism affected sexual well-being, menstrual health, or menopause, the levels of comfort were much, much lower. We also asked women what their preference would be for who would initiate a discussion about each of these different topics. And there's quite a bit of information here, but basically the dark red bars are when they would say, I'd prefer it to be me to initiate this discussion. The blue bars are when they said, I would actually prefer my doctor to raise this topic. The black bars, you can see when they're saying, well, I wouldn't want to discuss this at all. And the yellow ones are saying, well, I wouldn't want to really have any preference. You can see that it's around 16, 17%. So that's like 1 in 6 of the women that we interviewed said they would not want to discuss sexual health with a GP or nurse in the general practice. Most of the other topics they were happy talking about. But the thing that's interesting here is that for none of these different options did over 50% say that was their preference. So we can't necessarily say, okay, this is the simple answer here, but what it means is we can't take a kind of one-size-fits-all approach to this. We can't just assume that if women want to talk about their physical health or about menopause, that they're going to raise the topic, because some women do, some women don't, and some women wouldn't mind if their doctor raised the issue, but they'd prefer to raise it themselves. So we can see that there needs to be a lot more kind of sensitivity to the individual preferences of individual women. And one of the things here would be to say, maybe we all have time waiting in the reception in the general practice, maybe asking people, how would you prefer to raise these topics? Or are there any topics that you would like to discuss that maybe maybe could let the GP know, and they could bring up the issue beforehand? There are things we could do to maybe facilitate this a little bit more. I'm only going to show you 2 other slides, and I'll because I don't want to throw too much information, but one of them, which was again interesting and slightly disappointing, is whether when we asked participants whether they thought that doctors and nurses in their GP practice did each of these things. Now, if you look at the first 3, these are things that we would hope that they would do with all patients, that they would explain things in a way that's easy to understand. They would give patients the opportunity to ask questions, and they would check that patients understood what they say. And what we can see is there's a large proportion of respondents in the black kind of segment of these bars, which all add up to 100. So this is saying how would 100% of people responded. A lot of people said that they never or only sometimes do doctors do these kinds of things. So this is this general basic kind of communication skills that we'd expect GPs to kind of carry out. A lot of times they're failing to do that, which isn't great. But if we look at the bottom 3 characteristics, these are things that might be particularly relevant for autistic women, or whether women said that GPs give them enough time to process what they're saying, whether they check that they're communicating in their preferred way, so that whether that's in person, on the phone, or wherever it might be, and whether they accommodate their sensory needs. What we can find here is it's nearly half of the women said that they don't get enough time to process information. And the majority, so over 2/3, are saying that that their sensory needs aren't being appropriately responded to or recognized, and that the preferred communication strategies aren't necessarily being used. So we find that the general picture, the top 3, says in general, communication isn't good, these kind of skills. But when it comes to those things where there might be specific adaptations to communication skills, when they know that they're dealing, when GPs know that we're dealing with an autistic one, they need to do more to actually accommodate those particular needs. And then going further on that pathway of asking about experiences and whether there's satisfaction there, the last thing I'm going to show you is responses to the question about whether our respondents thought that health professionals in GP practice know how their autism affects different aspects of their well-being. And what we can find here, the black bars are when they said there's never any evidence that they do these things. What we get from this is a clear picture that women feel that doctors and nurses in general practice don't understand how their autism affects their sexual health in general, their experience of menstruation, or their experience of menopause. So there's clearly a lot of room for improvement there to make sure that health professionals do understand these things, and then not only understand them, but also act appropriately by doing things like communicating the appropriate way, providing information in alternative formats, those kind of things. So that's the current study. As I said, we're still analyzing in greater detail things like, are these issues more difficult for more recently diagnosed women, and so on. But what it leads into is it's setting the foundation for it's useful information in itself, obviously, but it's setting a foundation for planned research where we want to conduct more qualitative studies of autistic women's experiences of sexual and reproductive and menstrual health more broadly. But even more importantly, to talk to healthcare professionals about their understanding, their knowledge, and their beliefs as well. And the idea there is to identify gaps between women's needs and healthcare professionals' knowledge, motivation, and capacity. And what we'd hope to do is to develop the appropriate resources to help healthcare professionals to deliver more effective and more appropriate healthcare for autistic women when it comes to these issues around menopause in particular, but also just sexual health more broadly, because that was the image that we got from this research. Is it wasn't just about menopause, it was about sexual well-being more broadly and sexual health. As with the previous presentation, we'd like to learn more about what you think about our priorities should be for future research. There's another Padlet wall where you can put up those comments. If you go to that page and you click on the little green icon in the bottom right corner, you can see that. And as previously, the wall will remain active after the webinar. I'm just going to go to my last slide though, because I have to finish with this one about saying here endeth the mansplaining. And I'm of course, I'm highly aware of the fact that as a cisgender male, I have no experience of this, but hopefully I'm part of, I'll be seen as an ally and somebody who can be part of the solution to addressing some of these issues, which are clearly really important and not currently being addressed appropriately. There's my email address again if you want it, but I'll just flick back to that page, which has the Padlet wall. And we'll leave it at that. So should I stop sharing my screen, I gather?
You can leave your screen up. I think we're going to just have a sort of well, we're running maybe a little bit behind schedule, so we'll just have a 1 minute 1 minute break. No, not your fault at all. A 1 minute break now, just with the Padlet, and then we'll come back and we'll have some questions for Richard.
And I think is the link for the Padlet wall in the chat as well.
Should be, and if not, it's being copied in as we speak. So, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So I've got a couple of questions specifically for you, Richard, and then we will be broadening out to the wider group. So if you have any questions for the wider group that you didn't ask earlier, please do add them into the comments on Facebook or into the Q&A on Zoom. So one of the questions here for you, Richard, is: are you sharing your findings back to GPs?
Yeah, well, I did just tap something into the response in the comments in the chat as well, and that's the idea is that we will use the interview data that we already have plus the questionnaire data in when we do another round of collection of information with GP. So whether that's through interviews or through questionnaires, but the idea would be to say, we've found that 98% say this, are you aware of that? Also, what do you think might be able to be done with that? Because, and we want it to be, it has to be something which is not a kind of ticking off kind of exercise. Part of it is about showing the information. What we need to do is first of all, check out, are people actually aware of the gaps between what women say they need and what they're getting? And how might GPs say that can be addressed as well? Because if we get, and the idea would be to develop some kind of resources, whether that's materials that are there, either paper or online kind of things, or whether it's training courses they could go to or something like that. But the idea is to actually, from here on, is involve health professionals more in discussions about these are the gaps. How do we actually address them? What's feasible in general practice? What are the other ways in which we could address this? So definitely we want to use this in a way as a feeding forward, a rolling forward mechanism to hopefully change things, rather than just saying, isn't this rubbish? Okay, let's do more research with women. Yeah, there's a need to involve health professionals as well.
Absolutely. Thanks for that. Another sort of related question is time in appointments something that you looked at? Could potentially GPs look at giving autistic people longer appointments?
Yeah, we've thought about that's a really interesting suggestion. And again, that's one of the things we'd actually like to bring up with GPs, because they might say, oh, we can't have any more time in consultations. But then the idea would be, okay, are there things that could be done outside of consultations, or ways to make the consultations more effective? So if you had things like a checklist that someone could fill in beforehand, or a list of hot topics that someone might want to put down and say, even if it was just a form where they said, do you have any questions about any of these things? Just tick the boxes, so that they could actually be prepared, or they would know that this is something that a patient would like for them to bring up if they feel uncomfortable bringing up the issue as well. So there are definitely things to do. There are ways of longer consultations would be good, but also those longer consultations are only going to be effective if people know what to do in that longer time as well, to make it more appropriate behavior. You don't just want, if you've got 7 minutes and it's bad, you don't want 10 minutes of bad stuff. You want 10 minutes of even better stuff than you're getting in your 7 minutes currently.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there any plans for exploring the intersection with complex PTSD, autism, and menopause?
Yeah, so that's one of the things we're looking at. So we did ask other questions about other characteristics that women had that may have influenced their experiences of healthcare of menopause as well. And that's one of the things we want to look at. So we're looking at other neurological and neurodevelopmental conditions that might influence things. We're looking at other conditions that might affect psychological well-being, and also other conditions that might affect mobility. So what we're going to be doing as we carry on with the analysis is looking at whether those experiences are more difficult for women who have additional conditions or additional needs.
Interesting. Looking at the questions I've got left here. So how is ASD and ADHD being differentiated when identifying the menopause symptoms being experienced?
Well, that might be one where we need to broaden things out a bit. That's probably reached to my knowledge. It is important to look at. It does tie a little bit back into what we're looking at, is where we want to look at the coexistence, but also the intersections of different conditions, because I think we're only actually at the starting point of trying to work out how much, what the difference is, but also what we can attribute things to as well. Rebecca, Rachel, even Julie might know other things.
Yes, there's actually incredibly little on ADHD and menopause experiences. I think we did a review recently. It's not published or anything. It's just something we're working on, but I think there was like one paper. So it really is an area which has just been completely overlooked. We know that diagnosis rates are quite low in ADHD in women as well. And so that's likely why, but it's something that's probably going to be very important, but we just don't really know enough about it at the moment.
Yeah, just to add to that, please do have a look at the resources that we posted on the link, because there are a number of podcasts with people, ADHDers, discussing their experiences of menopause, which can be quite helpful to hear. But I think another point, and I apologise if someone already touched on this, but there's also individuals with, I don't know, ADHD, autistic ADHDers, and that's another intersection that we just don't know enough about, even though a number of our participants were ADHDers. I think there's, from our findings, it looked like there were particular challenges and experiences that that intersection faced, but we just don't know enough about it.
Thank you. Well, I think it makes sense to open up to the wider group for the rest of the questions. I've got a few here that were submitted earlier on, as well as some that come in since then. So, are you looking at, or is anyone else looking at, whether surgical menopause impacts people differently?
I think that, I mean, my work so far has been people, I think almost everyone who took part has gone through menopause naturally. There may be slightly different experiences in terms of medical professionals, because often if people have a surgical menopause because of surgical hysterectomy, then they often are put on HRT quite early, and it can have, and sometimes it obviously happens earlier in their lifespan as well. So so I wonder if the experience will be different. I'm not sure the symptoms would be different, but I'm not aware of an awful lot of work in that, especially not specifically related to autistic people's experiences. Anybody else? They know more.
Rachel?
I was just going to say, sorry, Julie and I had a couple of participants who had a surgical menopause, I believe. Do you recall them, Julie? Did you want to say anything on this?
No, I was going to say as well, some research that we haven't yet published, there are quite a few women who had hysterectomies earlier in life. Yeah, also, I'm not aware of anything that has specifically looked at that in autism. But it's an important question, because if your life phase is different, there can be very different experience with different stresses and different issues going on. But I'm not aware of anything that is specifically disentangling that for autism and menopause.
I am aware of a book which I'll post in the chat, and one of the authors is autistic. So it's, I think, a series of people writing about their experiences of surgical menopause, and at least one of the people who reached out to me is autistic, so her experience will be in there as well.
Thank you, that's great. A question about work and coping with the menopause at work. Have you come across any good ways of coping with the menopause at work, and asking for reasonable adjustments?
I think very variable by workplace, to be honest. I think some places are doing a really good job. I've heard people talk about, their employers being very sort of accommodating and very much setting up menopause groups for people and encouraging people to take part in them, and other people who get almost nothing. I think, once again, the variability of experience is going to be really broad. In terms of what you can do about it, I think encourage people. I think maybe talk to HR if possible about accommodations and trying to get those accommodations put in place, because they should be able to support you with that. But I think you'll have different experiences depending on where you work, unfortunately.
A lot of places have a menopause policy, a lot of organisations, and so you can ask to see their menopause policy and what's on it. It's really tough. I would say please feel free to reach out, because if we can help by forwarding your organisation some information about autistic menopause, we'd be very happy to do so.
Thank you, that's very kind. So a question around sensory needs. Do sensory needs change, such as interoception, so emotions, hunger, thirst, etc.? And do they change again after menopause?
I'm trying to do some interoception work in menopause at the moment, actually. I don't think we have as far as I know, there is no published research on this topic. So what I'm going to say is entirely based on my experience talking to people. I think that the sensory changes can be a challenge during menopause. And I think that some of Rachel and Julie's and Richard's work sort of speaks to that people's sensory experiences can be quite overwhelming. during menopause. I think depending on what nobody's looked at really is that how interoception is sort of interacting with that. So if you're experiencing a symptom and you don't know why, you may have a much more distressing experience because you can't explain what's happening in your body. On the other hand, you may have actually be much less aware of what's happening in your body, and therefore that might actually be a benefit. You may actually sort of go through the menopause sort of in a slightly smoother way, and we just really don't know the answer to that. I think in truth, speaking to people, I think, that you get a lot of people talking about the fact that something's going on, they don't really know what it is, they find it hard to describe it to the doctor. And therefore, those things about interoception difficulties may have quite significant effects on people's individual experiences. But I really don't have anything more than anecdotal reports to sort of contribute to that.
Yeah, and I don't have anything firmer otherwise, but I would just think as well about, if people are experiencing these things and think, okay, I don't quite know how to explain or describe them, if they're explaining those things to someone else who's not aware of the issues, the likelihood that they're going to be met in some way or understood is going to be partial, if any understanding at all. And it means that therefore the responses aren't necessarily going to be appropriate. And then you could have a difficult situation where people think, well, I've just tried to describe this, it didn't work out. What's the point? People don't listen anyway. They don't want to understand as well. So there can be these unfortunate kind of cycles of, well, I tried, I did as well as I could. I don't quite know what I meant to be describing. The person didn't really respond in the appropriate way. What's the point? And people are left to then struggle by themselves. So it goes back into that thing I was saying before about that. It is that whole kind of, yes, there's a body producing these kind of things, a physical body, which leads to these changes. But also if you're living with that independently or not with this kind of support from either friends or family or from health professionals, it can be really, multiply debilitating, because these things have to be managed and experienced in social contexts as well. So, if you're not able to discuss these things and get the appropriate support, whether it's at work or from health professionals, it can be, a really distressing and debilitating experience.
Just to add on the end of that answer as well, I think these difficulties can also affect your ability to use apps and things that are out there for autistic, that are out there for the general population. Because if you struggle with interoception or with alexithymia, so recognizing your emotions, you might not be able to read a list of symptoms and say, okay, I experienced that. And so it makes it a lot harder to, describe your experience.
Thanks very much. I've got one here about women with learning disabilities. This person said that they're rarely on HRT at this time in life. Is there any information for this population that you know of?
Not to my knowledge, but it's so critical because, and maybe others will have something to add, we don't know what HRT uptake is like for autistic people, neurodivergent people, people with or without learning disabilities. We don't know. And the fact that we don't know is so significant because HRT uptake is really significantly linked to your later health and, really, really quite big. It has a lot of health significance for your later life and wellness. So the fact that we don't know, and the fact that people may not be, possibly they're not getting the same access to these treatments, is really, really important and problematic.
Okay, I'm going to cover one more question, I think, now, just looking at my list here. Are there any plans for quantitative studies comparing permanent post-menopause differences compared to menstruating years? So they've given an example, e.g. is a loss of executive function due to menopause for the rest of an autistic person's lifespan?
I mean, that is really interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it would need quite a detailed, complex longitudinal study to look at that to be, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't do it. I think that that the issue is that we would expect executive functions to change as people get older. So we know that executive functions get worse as they get older. They're one of the main cognitive abilities that changes as we age. Actually, a lot of ways more so than memory, despite the fact that's what we all think about getting worse as we get older. And so the issue is whether or not there's an interaction between those things. We also know that lots of other things affect executive function in later life as well. So low mood affects executive function in late life. So we really need to think about how all of these things may interact together. We do often see sort of improvements again when those, like when mood stabilizes and other things happen. So I think it's an open question about whether or not these changes may be slightly temporary and then go back to sort of normal levels or normal age appropriate levels or not. I just don't think we have the answers to those questions yet.
Well, thank you. I think that's probably all we've got time now for questions. I think there's a couple more that have come in that we've not quite covered, but I gather that you are happy to cover those afterwards, so we'll follow up on those. But just want to thank everyone that's joined us today and for all of your questions, your comments and your contributions in the chat. It's really helped us to dig much deeper into the topic and sort of bring this back to real people's lives and experiences. If you want to hear about future webinars and the latest autism research and about how you can get involved in studies like these, you can join the Autistica network on our website, and I believe that a link will be added into the chat for those of you that aren't already on that. But all that's left for me to say is a huge thank you to Rachel, to Julie, to Rebecca and Richard for sharing their work with us today and for answering your questions so thoroughly and thoughtfully. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you all with us. Thank you so much. And as I said, the session today will be recorded and will be put on YouTube, so you can all catch up on anything that you missed and listen back again and share it with others who you think might be interested. So thank you, everyone. I really appreciate your time today, and it's been a really interesting session. I've learned a lot. So thank you.